So this is the problem with this picture.
You look okay. Hello. How do you do? Good morning.
Good day. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. This is so thrilling, and so I'm thrilled to bits. Well, thank you so much for being here to talk to me. My name is Ricardo Calderon. I am from Peru. I am one of the biggest Bee Gees fans in Peru. I saw the Bee Gees in Buenos Aires, Argentina, 24 years ago. And
you're a serious fan, my friend. You're a really serious fan.
You see behind me, they're all Bee Gees CDs, collections.
Wonderful. I wish I were there to go and pick some out.
You're free. You're welcome. You're free to come down to Peru one day. Anyways, I hope this takes place one day in future. So
I do too.
And I have seen you. I have seen several interviews on the internet, on YouTube with you, and I just learned that you're a filmmaker, you're a professor at UCLA. Yeah, you're a biographer. If you're a writer and paperback writer, I guess that's the job.
Well, the Bee Gees book I did come out in paperback, so that would make me a paperback writer. Ah, the original copy. Ah, you have
a small
both.
one.
Excellent.
And this is it.
That was a very exciting experience. You can imagine.
Yeah, I've read your book several times, and I need more to see. I would like to read more, but unfortunately, well, this was printed out when it was 1979, I guess.
79, and I believe I think I heard that Barry is writing his autobiography. Yes.
You see, I guess, yeah, I heard somebody say that as well, but I'm not quite sure if that is really certain, true. Yeah, I don't know.
I hope it is.
Have you,
Barry is a wonderful man.
Have you been in touch with him in the past years or recently?
Yes, I've just written a book called God Only Knows: The Story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. And Barry is an enormous fan of Brian Wilson and the Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. And I asked Barry if he would write an essay for the introductory section of the book.
I have read it.
He wrote a beautiful essay, really beautiful.
Yeah, it's a 2-page piece of writing that he did for your book, right?
Yes, sir.
Entitled Words.
I called it Words.
You called it Words.
When I was sequencing the opening section of the book, I had a small quote from Paul McCartney, so I called that the overture.
Yes, yes.
And then an essay from Brian Wilson's wife, Melinda, and then Barry's, and it just seemed like, well, we've heard the overture, now let's hear the words.
It's beautifully, it's been beautifully written. I bought it, as a matter of fact, I bought it yesterday. I bought the book on Amazon. It's on, I think it's on PDF. It's a Kindle book, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, you can buy the physical book.
I will.
Yes. Well, but I don't mean you have to. I'm just saying one could if one chose to.
I want to buy it actually, but I don't know if it would be too much of me to ask you if you could sign it, autograph it. Would it be too much to ask? Would that be possible, do you think?
Well, if you were here, I would love to sign it for you, but it's a long way to Peru.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it would be hard, but
I'm expecting there's a bookstore in Los Angeles that I'm going to be talking to soon, where they sell autographed copies, and I'm going to see if they want to do that.
If they do so, I would like to get one. I would like to purchase one copy of the original.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll let you know. It'll probably be a couple of months, but right now the book is out in the UK, and you can buy it online from Amazon.co.uk, and they'll ship it anywhere.
I've been an Amazon customer for about 27 years, I guess, since 1999. So
Wow.
most of my CDs were bought at amazon.co.uk or amazon.com.
Oh, great. Oh, great.
I'm a huge collector. Well, I know that in the world there are so many other BG collectors, diehard fans like me, you know, but.
Well, we're all fans. Those of you and I, and those people listening, those people who've read the book, those who listen to the music, those who've seen the film I did, This Is Where I Came In, or the more recent documentary on HBO that I was a consultant for. I worked on the Grammy salute to the Bee Gees, Staying Alive, back in 2000. Was that 2017? I created the little documentary packages.
I saw it on cable TV, actually, and I also bought the Bee Gees video. I think it's right there behind me, where at the end of the film, the documentary, Morris Gibb says to Barry, "That's they believe. That's they believe," pointing at you, I guess.
Yes, it was. We were at I believe it was at the MGM Grand for the One Night Only concert.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I was there with a camera crew to cover it for a television program I was working on at the time, and I just got such a kick out of it because, in the world of, we'll call it show business, I've been fortunate to work with and meet a lot of famous people, but the Bee Gees hold a very special place in my heart. And so the fact that Morris saw me and pointed me out, I just had to put that in the DVD. So that was just fun for me, that he saw me in the distance, and then they played a little thing at the keyboard. That was great fun.
I wish I was there. I wish I had been there. And I have some questions to ask you.
Sure.
First of all, about your book, God Only Knows, the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. I understand from my reading that you did write a book many years earlier about the Beach Boys.
Yes.
Is this a sequel, or are you retelling the story of the Beach Boys?
So the book that I wrote, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, came out in 1978. It was actually just before that book came out, when RSO Records was looking for somebody to write the Bee Gees biography, that an executive there named Jay Levy read my book in galleys and said, "Oh, this is the guy who should write the Bee Gees book." So there's a direct connection to it. The new edition of my book has the 1978 book in its entirety in it. There's a new opening, and then there's a massive update, because the last time the book was in print was 1985. So actually the update is more than half the length of the original book. So wow. You're getting two books for the price of one, in essence. It's over 450 pages long. It's a big book.
What a bargain! Yeah, nice.
Thank you.
Very nice.
But it was, the sequence of events in life, because I was a Bee Gees fan. Growing up in New York, I heard New York mining disaster on the radio, and I've got to get a message to you. And I started a joke, and all the big hits of 67 and 68. And then the Bee Gees sort of disappeared. I didn't read rock magazines. I didn't even really know there were rock magazines. I was just kind of a teenager who was a fan. And I remember at college, around 1969 being in the record store and buying Best of the Bee Gees. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, here I can get, a bunch of my favorite Bee Gees songs.
And when you wrote this book about the Beach Boys, I understand that you interviewed a lot of people, engineers, musicians.
Yes.
Did you also interview Carl and Dennis Wilson when they were alive?
I did. I interviewed Dennis extensively in one marathon session, like 4 or 5 hours at his home in Venice, California. I interviewed Carl less. Carl was a reluctant interviewee, if you will. There was so much that people didn't want to talk about. There was so much kind of pain and sadness associated with their story. That Carl was, considered the peacemaker in the Beach Boys, but it was a very difficult group in terms of rivalries and jealousies. And so Carl didn't want to speak about it a lot. I did spend some time with him because as I became friendly with Brian, sometimes he would say, come on, we're going to go see Carl. But I didn't get to know Carl as well as I got to know Dennis. Dennis was really Dennis was like sticking your finger in an electric socket and then having it going off. He was just full of energy. It's full of life.
Was he something like Morris Gibb?
Dennis wasn't as, Morris was really funny. Morris had a great sense of humor and I guess the British would say he was always taking the piss out of you. Morris just was fun-loving in a very different way from Dennis. Dennis was like, okay, how many hours are there in the day? I'm going to get as much life out as I can of this 24 hours. And maybe I'll sleep and maybe I won't.
So he was electric.
He was electric. Carl was very calm. And Brian was, while you knew they were brothers, Brian is very private. Brian doesn't really like to talk that much. Very introverted. I think, they were each damaged in their own way by the abuse of their father. And then the amount of, just like the Bee Gees, they had this enormous success when they were very, very young, and they really didn't know how to deal with it. Barry once said something to me, and he used the phrase "first fame," meaning the Bee Gees had their first fame in '67 and '68, and he said the question is, can you survive first fame? Because when you first hit it as a teenager, there's cars and girls, and there's all this madness around you. How do you survive it? Morris said to me, he says, well, we were pilly, potty, and pissy. meaning Robin was taking pills, he was drinking, and Barry was smoking pot. That was the way they dealt with it.
So what was the booze?
Morris.
I mean, Morris was the booze, and Barry was the pot, and Robin was the pill. I think
pills. That's what Morris said. Yes, but that's a very simplistic way to do it. So what happened musically, whether it was the Wilson brothers or the Gibb brothers, when they were together, there was a certain DNA magic that happened that created these harmonies that are everlasting, that touch us and make us feel in a certain way that is beyond anything we ever could have imagined.
So the Beach Boys influenced many groups, right? Because
yes.
one time I read an article on the internet where Morris said that his song on Living Eyes, which is there, the song Wildflower was influenced by the Beach Boys. And the same was said about one song on their last album, the very last album they did, This Is Where I Came In, where Morris sings the song Walking on Air. which sounds like it has something. It has something from the Beach Boys, you know, the sound, the California sound, and that
Yeah,
funky sound.
if you're Graham Nash once said, if you're singing harmony, then Brian Wilson was the most influential thing, what he did with the Beach Boys. Any harmony group looked at what he was doing, listened to what he was doing, and said, this is different, this is special. So the Hollies, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Queen, etc., ELO, and of course the Bee Gees.
Do you think the Beatles were influenced by the Beach Boys as well?
Well, I know they were. I know the Beatles were significantly influenced, both from personal interviews. I interviewed Paul McCartney extensively about the influence of the Pet Sounds album on the Beatles. I interviewed George Martin extensively, and he said, if I had to select one living genius of popular music, I would choose Brian Wilson. That's how in high regard the Beatles world looked at Brian. George Martin, again referring to Pet Sounds, he said, and this was unbelievable when he said it, that Sgt. Pepper was our attempt to equal Pet Sounds. That's how big a deal Brian Wilson was to the Beatles. John Lennon didn't speak that much publicly about it. There's one great piece that he did for one of the English rock newspapers where he's talking about the single that preceded Pet Sounds called The Little Girl I Once Knew, where he was talking about how much he loved that record and what Brian Wilson did. As Sir Paul told me, he said, I played Pet Sounds so much when it first came out to John that it would be very hard to escape the influence of it. And he specifically pointed at the Beatles song Here, There, and Everywhere as one that, okay, well, let's do a Beach Boys kind of harmony on that one. But the Beatles were influenced by the Everly Brothers, and they had their own harmony thing going on as well. But Brian Wilson influenced and inspired them in terms of arrangement and record production in particular. It was what Brian Wilson was doing was ahead of everybody else. When he did Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations in 1966, the entire world, the entire music world was like, what is going on? So there was actually a poll in one of the English rock newspapers where the Beach Boys came out ahead of the Beatles as best pop vocal group. It's hard to imagine, here we are 56 years later, that could have happened. But that's how big a deal Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys were.
And how would you regard the Bee Gees in comparison to the Beach Boys?
Well, you know, I refer, I've talked about teaching a class at UCLA called the Killer Bees, that would have the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Bee Gees, and Bob Dylan. Because, you know, truth be told, if that was the only music we had gotten in our lifetimes, we would have done pretty darn well. Now, of course, we have other things we love. We all have different tastes. The Bee Gees are unfairly underrated in every way, shape, and form.
Totally. I agree with you.
I believe Barry Gibb is the second most successful songwriter after Sir Barry, after Sir Paul, of the rock era. They made, I get, I don't know what you call them in Peru, goosebumps, you know,
Yeah.
chills, just thinking about the sounds and how many great records they made. Where the Bee Gees really suffered was the rock critics. When Saturday Night Fever happened, the rock critics were more interested in punk rock than beautifully constructed R&B records. And they unfairly labeled the Bee Gees as disco because of Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah, I remember that Robin hated that word, the name disco.
They all hated it. Barry hated it. Robin hated it. Morris, because it wasn't disco music. Disco music had a certain thump, 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 thump. The Bee Gees music didn't have that. They had Barry. We were making R&B music like Earth, Wind, and Fire. But long before Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees had already created a body of work that should have earned them a place very quickly in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The rock critics are a funny bunch, and the Bee Gees were just not as highly regarded. Now, to be fair, when I listened to the albums in the early 1970s, there are a few albums in there, like Life in a Tin Can, that I just kind of shake my head and go, oh boy, those are not up to par. Those are not up to par. But the Bee Gees kept reinventing themselves. You know, as I said, I was a fan from the very beginning in 1967. And I remember when How Can You Mend a Broken Heart and Lonely Days came out, it was like, oh great, the Bee Gees are back. Now, this was only 3 years after they had first appeared. So they went through their first phase of their career in lightning fashion. They were, who's the Bee Gees? The Bee Gees are unbelievable. I love the Bee Gees. They're gone. Now they're back within 3 years. And then things started, I don't know what was going on in 71 through 74. They didn't seem to be, you know, firing on all cylinders, if you will.
They seem to be stuck in that first part of the 70s.
They had done great work. Those first 4 albums in the 60s were amazing. And Odessa is a concept album. It was just magnificent work. I remember we had a television show here in America called the Midnight Special. And I remember when the Bee Gees were on and did nights on Broadway, I was so excited. Oh my God, the Bee Gees are back. I mean, it was just amazing to hear yet another iteration of the Bee Gees making great records. And it was, you know, if you were just listening from the point of view of these are great songs, beautifully sung, well, you had to be a Bee Gees fan. But the culture, they didn't quite fit into the culture. They seem to be always out of time with the culture. If you think of what was going on, you know, Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead, the Bee Gees didn't really fit into that. Exactly. And then you think, you know, then you think of the late 70s with punk rock. The Bee Gees certainly didn't fit into that. They weren't part of disco, but they got labeled disco. I remember going to a preview screening of Saturday Night Fever with a dear old friend, Michelle Meyer, who's no longer with us. She was kind of the doyenne of the LA music scene. She worked at the Whiskey a Go-Go and other clubs like that. So she really had her finger on the pulse of everything. And at the screening, we didn't know what we were about to see. There hadn't been any advanced publicity on Saturday Night Fever. It was really just this little independent movie. And when it started with the Bee Gees, it was like, oh my God, there they are again. And I mean, you know, the first, you know, being in a movie theater, the first time you hear a song, it reminded me of when I went to see the Beatles movies, A Hard Day's Night in Hell, how great the songs were the first time. And when I heard How Deep Is Your Love, well, that became my favorite Bee Gees song of all time up till then. So it was very exciting as a fan. I had no idea what was in store for me after that. Up until 1977, I was just a fan.
So you didn't think about, you were not thinking, I will write about the Bee Gees, I will do their biography.
Never crossed my mind. I never really thought of myself as a book writer until I had this series of circumstances that I talk about in God Only Knows that led me to write this book about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys.
And had you written other books prior to the Bee Gees' authorized biography?
Not only had I not written books, I was a journalist. I wrote short articles, 250 words, 500 words. I had a fanzine that I published that I'd write an article or two for.
So you are a professor, you're a writer.
I was certainly not a professor then.
Back then.
But when I was in college, if I walked into a class and the professor said, there'll be a midterm and a final and a term paper, I might drop the class because I was so lazy. I didn't want to write anything as long as a term paper. So the fact that a few years later I became an author, it was really like stunning to me, stunning to my parents, because they knew what kind of a student I was, and to my friends who knew that I was not, shall we say, a great academic scholar during my school days. So the fact that I'm a professor is even more amazing than maybe anything. But so the book on Brian and the Beach Boys led to the Bee Gees book, because the same company that put together the first book was doing the Bee Gees book. They had done a book on the Beatles. They had done my book on Brian and the Beach Boys, and now they were going to do a book on the Bee Gees. And I was thrilled to hear that I was being considered for it. And then all of a sudden, in the summer of 1978, before my first book had come out, I was on my way to Miami to meet the Bee Gees and interview them and spend time with them and their families and in the studio and get to work on what became the authorized autobiography.
So you must have pictures with them, with the three brothers, separately and together, or not?
The only picture I have, well, back then we didn't have cell phones.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't, and I was never much on, hey, could you give me a picture? It's not so smart. But I finally got this picture with Barry. But anyway,
cross your mind then that somebody else would take a picture of you and Barry, and you and Robin, and you and Morris, or the three of them together with you?
There was nobody around. And I don't know whether I was right or wrong. I almost thought it was like unprofessional. It's like I'm there to do a job. I'm not there to get my picture taken.
I see.
Dumb me. Anyway, I was in Miami for a few days. I met Huey, their father, their lovely mother, Barbara. I interviewed everybody. I spent 2 days in the studio, and two unbelievable things happened beyond what happens in recording studios. On the first day I was there, Barry was going to sing the lead vocal for Too Much Heaven, but everyone else had left. I had not heard the song before. The only ones left were Carl and Albie, the engineer producers. They were sitting at the console behind me. I was sitting in a couch in front of the console. Directly in front of me was the glass, and just on the other side of the glass was the microphone and Barry. And he had the studio dark, and it was just the four of us. And he started to sing, and I'm thinking to myself, is this the greatest? Am I delusional? This is like the greatest song I've ever heard in my whole life. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And it turns out I wasn't delusional. Here we are 44 years later, and it's one of the greatest songs ever written and recorded. So that was an amazing night, an amazing privilege to be there, just watching as he's singing. And, I never asked him who he was singing to or what he was thinking about as he sang it. But whatever the process was, that beautiful vocal came out. I don't even remember how many takes he did. It might only have been one take. And that's how great they were in the studio.
I was about to ask you that, but how many takes did he do? You can't remember.
I don't remember. I can picture him on the glass. I can picture the way he was moving and swaying to the music. I can hear it, but I don't remember how many takes. It was just, I was just lost in the moment. So that was maybe the greatest, well, that was tied for the greatest musical experience I'd ever had in my life up till then.
So you were in heaven at that moment, right?
What's that?
You were in heaven at that moment.
I was indeed in heaven.
Nice.
I had too much heaven at that time.
Yeah, good for you. I'm so glad.
It was amazing. The only other experience similar, in a very different way, I worked on a television show the year before called Sinatra and Friends, starring Frank Sinatra. And I was in a sound stage with Frank Sinatra and the Nelson Riddle Orchestra, and just me and the producer watching Frank Sinatra sing. And that was like, oh my goodness, how did I get here? What can I do to stay in this room? So those at that point in life, those would be tied for the most amazing things I'd ever experienced in my career, in my life musically, other than going to a Paul McCartney in concert or something like that. This was different. This was privileged. This was private. The next day, apparently, Too Much Heaven was the last lead vocal that needed to be recorded for the album, because the next day, Robert Stigwood came to the studio and the Bee Gees played him the entire Spirits Having Flown album from start to finish.
Wow.
And it was obviously the first time I had heard it. And when it was done, and I'll do a very bad impression of Mr. Stigwood, rest in peace. He said, "My boys, you've made your Sergeant Pepper."
Oh, wow. Indeed.
So
yeah.
that was a pretty amazing moment.
This album.
That is the album.
Is
that the program from the songbook? Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, it's all, I think, over 20 million copies worldwide. I read statistics.
It set, what's fascinating, Saturday Night Fever was not considered a Bee Gees album, as dumb as that sounds. It was considered a soundtrack to a movie, and it sold, I don't know, 30 million copies or whatever it sold. Mm-hmm. When Spirits Having Flown came out, and the first 3 singles were #1, right?
Yes. Tragedy, Too Much Heaven, and Love You Inside Out.
And it was and it sold in the tens of millions. People were saying, well, it didn't do as well as Saturday Night Fever. And now that's crazy. But that's the world was turning because of a couple of things. One, there was a certain anger at disco music in general, and the Bee Gees became the target of that disco music, unfairly. 2, because of the records that Brian produced for little brother Andy, there was not just the Bee Gees on the radio, there was Andy Gibb in what sounded like Bee Gees records.
Exactly.
There was Samantha Sang in what sounded like a Bee Gees record. There was Frankie Valli in what sounded like a Bee Gees record. And so there was this endless wall-to-wall Bee Gees music. I think they had the top 5, they had written the top 5 singles at one point in that time. There was a sign in Times Square in New York, which... Yeah,
it's in the book. It's in this book.
The book. Yes. A friend of mine was in charge of that sign.
Really?
That was his job.
You have forgotten one song, the one that they did for Samantha Sang.
Yeah, no, I mentioned Samantha. I mentioned Emotion. I just didn't mention by title. So there's all of Andy's hits, all of their hits. The Saturday Night Fever stuff is still being played, and the anger at disco became centered on them. And there was this horrible night at a stadium in Chicago. They called it Disco Demolition Night, I think. And you can see it in the documentary. And so here's the truth about that night. What did disco music represent? Disco music represented African American